In the first episode, we looked at how the extra armor vehicle upgrade developed and faded into obscurity, both in terms of model kits and within the rules across the span of the editions which featured it. Over the span of the time frame we covered, we also witnessed the Mark I Rhino replaced with the current Mark II design, and mentioned how this changeover affected other vehicles which use the Rhino chassis as a basis, until new fully plastic kits were released for each of them. In this video, I aim to take a detailed look at every Mark I Rhino chassis-based vehicle, vaguely in the order in which they were released, making comments on design and painting choices where appropriate. I must limit the scope of the video for it to remain a watchable length, thus I will only be focusing on what was released by Citadel for 40k and 28mm scale. No epic scale models, no armor cast upgrade kits. These things may end up being covered later down the line, no promises are made though. Join me, dear viewer, for an adventure into Games Workshop's past, to the times when these kits were still brand new and shiny, as we chart the development and expansion of the Space Marine vehicle range on the tabletop in the final 2 decades of the previous century. Special thanks to the wonderful folks at the Stuff of Legends for allowing me to use some of their scans for this video. Please give them a visit at solegends.com if you're interested in this sort of stuff. The Mark I Rhino, still in wide circulation even in the early 2000s, was originally released in 1988, during the second year of the Rogue Trader era. The first kit bore the designation RTB-04 and contained not 1, but 3 Rhinos. Given that RTB-01 contained 30 Beaky Marines, RTB-04 was sufficient to transport all of them as 3 squads of 10 men. Pretty convenient. I will not even pretend to understand the rules which were released for it, however, as Rogue Trader was well before my time in the hobby, and indeed my time being alive at all. I will, however, deign to comment on how different these kits feel in the context of the original promotional materials. Compared to current vehicle kits, the Mark I Rhino was relatively low on detail and customizability options. You would be forgiven for thinking otherwise based on the language used in the adverts, however. The kit included engine exhausts, smoke and grenade launchers, a spiked ram attachment, and external accessories such as light fittings and handrails, allowing the Rhino to be built in a variety of ways, reflecting the multiplicity of roles filled by this mighty machine. A piece of customizability not mentioned here is the option to either use the 2 front plates or the more bulky singular front plate piece, which also served as the rear hatch, but the images clearly show this option. It's interesting seeing the exhaust, searchlights and handrails listed as features, as these things are just taken for granted as part of a Citadel tank these days. The studio would, in 3rd edition, take to heart that bit about the handrails being an optional external accessory though, as they completely disappeared from all the vehicles featured in the 3rd edition codices colour sections. I don't know why I'm spending so much time on this. I guess having grown up with kits that have a considerably larger number of parts on the sprues, it just feels weird to look at the kit and then look at the way they described the kit back in the day together. However, this was the first plastic vehicle Games Workshop produced, after all. In the absence of heavier tanks, calling it a mighty machine was not as amusing as doing so would be today, when things like the Predator Annihilator or the Baneblade are also kicking around on the tabletop. The way these vehicles were painted is also notably different from the way they would later appear. Beyond the apparent fact that camo schemes were clearly just the done thing in this era, as can be evidenced with the colour schemes featured in White Dwarf, the painting style itself is clearly different on the original studio models. The painting style is a lot more grimy, grim, and dark, if you'll excuse the expression. In the painting guidance article penned by John Blanche to go alongside the release of the kit, the use of an airbrush is recommended to create the smooth camo effects. To those who like to decry the airbrush as a newfangled invention with no place in the hobby, they have clearly been around since the start. It is apparent that a much greater emphasis was also placed on dry brushing as well. Honestly, just the feel of these models is generally more in line with the Forge World painting style from up until a few years ago, despite the potentially seizure-inducing camo schemes themselves demonstrated on the models in the showcase, and even more so the colour schemes section which did not use physically painted models. I suspect there is a reason these were illustrations and not actual models, to be honest. Good luck finding someone to paint this. To further emphasize the point about the camo schemes, both of these are Flesh Eater's rhinos, and this is apparently an Ultramarines tank. As you can see from these photographs, potential modifications to the Rhino kit were showcased from the very moment the Rhino became available to purchase. The aforementioned John Blanche article showcased the prototype for the Predator, and this one here, for example, would later show up as an actual component in the first Sisters of Battle Immolator in 1997. The third is perhaps the concept, which would later develop into the Salamander Scout vehicle, but before the Chimera chassis was developed. Just as likely, it's just a crazy kit bash that was done because it looked cool, which is equally valid. It would not be until the September of 1989 that the Rhino would be available as a single model kit with the release of RTB-12. But before then, in April, the first Predator kit, RTB-08, saw release. Sporting a round hemispherical turret and two side sponsons which fitted over the circular doors, in terms of armament, this was what would later be called a Predator Destructor, armed with an autocannon and las cannon sponsons. In terms of painting style, this is of course very similar to the original Rhino release. Everything I highlighted there also applies here. Interestingly, the Mark I Predator was a full plastic kit, utilizing an extra sprue to provide all the components necessary to build the Predator battle tank, including a flat front plate with an Aquila and no view hatch for the driver. This Predator would later be repackaged with one painted in the colours of the Blood Angels on the box, and would not be an unfamiliar sight on 2nd edition battlefields. The Mark I Razorback was the first mixed metal and plastic Rhino chassis vehicle produced by Games Workshop. Yes, there had previously been metal crew and accessories released for the Rhino, in fact, along with the original release of the plastic Rhino in RTB-04 back in 1988, but these were never sold as a kit with the vehicle itself to my knowledge, and, more importantly, never formed an integral part of the kit to make an entirely new vehicle with its own stat line. By the time the Razorback was released in the June of 1994, Warhammer 40,000 was already in its Technicolor 2nd edition. This kit made relatively minimal changes to the Rhino chassis, replacing the top hatch with a metal turret mounting plate, and adding a crude turret to the top with the rather eclectic choice of a twin-linked plasma gun and a las cannon as its weapon loadout. It is interesting to see how much more thought the people in the design studio, by which I mean Jez Goodwin and Norman Swales, gave the question of how a Space Marine can get through a hatch with those bulky pauldrons on his shoulders, as the turret has a 3-piece door, the central piece opening backwards and the two hatches on either side opening outwards to make room for the gunner's pauldrons.
The Whirlwind followed in May of 1995, 1 month after the release of Codex Ultramarines.
However, this was not the Whirlwind's first iteration on the tabletop in 28mm scale. White Dwarf had previously published an article on how to convert one from a variety of existing plastic components, card or plasticard plates, and a 40mm Citadel base cut in half. Yes, really. Among the painted examples included in this issue, there is this charming Space Wolves Rhino onto which the front plate, hatch, thing has been glued upside down for some reason. I mean, how would the driver see out of that? Isn't that supposed to be a window? Yes, I'm being nitpicky, but I'd probably have cut down the trim around the window gap, as we are instructed to do so with the ramp in the instructions for the missile array, and filled in the gap. To each their own, I guess. As much as I find this modelling choice baffling, the person behind it was clearly GW staff and I am not, so it's not exactly like I have some sort of professional basis to criticise their work. But I will adamantly maintain that it looks a bit weird. That minor tangent over, let us return to the actual Whirlwind kit. While the Razorback was the first of the mixed component Mark I kits, featuring both metal and plastic parts, it was the endearingly nicknamed Bunch of Crayons Whirlwind which established the design principles which would carry through all the successive mixed metal and plastic Space Marine tanks. While the Razorback replaced the rear top hatch, the Whirlwind went further, ditching the cupola at the front of the tank as well and replacing them with a sensor array. Just as the Razorback's turret was crewed, the Whirlwind included a Space Marine crewman to control the missile pods at the back of the tank. This may seem strange today in an age when both of these features are unmanned and controlled from within the tank itself, but I would point you to Brother Tinnitus here as evidence that even recently Games Workshop make questionable design choices with their vehicle kits. The Predator was the first of the original Rhino Mark I kits to be replaced, with another Mark I Rhino-based design, but with metal parts instead of a plastic Predator sprue this time. The new Predator Destructor, released in April 1996, despite the parts having 1995 etched into them, was more ambitious than the previous two mixed component kits. The top of the hull was covered by two hefty metal plates, one replacing the rear top hatch, the other covering up the front of the hull and providing a mounting point for the turret. This second version of the Predator was a lot boxier than the first, sporting a forward-mounted turret and two Lehman Russ-style side sponsons, all made out of hefty pieces of metal. I'm halfway convinced that the cylindrical sponson mount bit itself could be used as a murder weapon. Just thrown at someone with sufficient force would likely seriously injure them, and that's before we consider putting it into a sock and swinging it at someone, repeatedly bashing in their The Predator Destructor was soon followed by a kit for the Annihilator variant in October 1996. This contained virtually all the same pieces with the exception of a different round turret, which mounted twin las cannons instead of the Destructor's autocannon armament. These two kits hold special significance to this episode as I happen to have tracked down the parts for one of each of these and will be restoring, assembling and painting them in the second half of the video. Although not technically a Space Marine kit, the first version of the Immolator, released alongside the first Sisters of Battle Codex in the August of 1997, also used the Mark I Rhino as its basis. Here's some images of it. Okay, let's be honest, I almost left this tank out, and as a result I don't really have much prepared for what to say about it, other than the fact that it was a thing. I mean, I've already mentioned the driver's hatch extending out the front, only on one side having been done as early as 1988 to the Rhino. I guess I can mention how Space Marine armies also made use of this component. Oh, and in 2nd edition, the Immolator used a double flamer template for extra heretic burning capacity. Crispy. While the first Studio Predator Annihilator was painted in Space Wolves livery, this aspect making a permanent mark on the lore of the Annihilator variant, it was not ultimately a chapter-specific vehicle only available to the Space Wolves, even though they were the ones to invent or retrofit it into existence on the battlefield in a particularly tough engagement. 3rd edition saw the release of the first truly chapter-specific Space Marine tank, the Baal Predator, released with the Blood Angels Codex in December 1998. Interestingly, the Baal Predator pictured in the Codex is not an example of the kit itself, rather a conversion based on the Annihilator and some metal Ravenwing assault cannons. This is apparent from the lack of the sculpted Blood Angels insignia on the front plate, which was actually a metal part, the lack of a gunner, the slimmer assault cannons, and the fact that it says so right there on the page next to it. The actual Baal Predator kit did use the same round turret as the Annihilator, but it had its own 3-component assault cannon armament.
The side sponsons for the Baal Predator also had the option to be replaced with heavy flamers. These were not entirely a new component for the kit, however, but a metal version of the heavy flamer and fuel tanks included on the Imperial Vehicle Accessory sprue since at least 1995.
I also happen to have found one of these on eBay and intend to restore it to its former glory too, but that shall have to be in an addendum. This video is going to be ridiculously long as it is, and if I were to add footage of a 3rd tank to the hobby section, my laptop would either take off, burst into flames, or possibly a combination of the two if I were to try to render such a thing on it, given that it's running on an integrated graphics card. The Vindicator, released in March 1999, was perhaps the most ambitious design of the Mark I vehicle pool. I would have also said potentially the heaviest, but then I actually measured the tanks and the Predators were actually heavier. Not only did metal plates cover the entire central hull, there were also 6 metal plates on the side, 3 on each side, a thick mounting plate for the solid white metal demolisher cannon at the front, and a rear hatch which looked actually functional and a lot more detailed than the previous plastic component. Now that I think of it, the Predator turrets in the side sponsons are considerably chunkier pieces of metal than the all-around metal plating of the Vindicator. That's comparably thin, to be honest, so that's the weight mystery solved. What in my opinion marks it out among its brethren is that the Vindicator tank also dared to cover up the characteristic gap between the hull and the side components, which had for so long been a staple of the Mark I Rhino variants, and an obvious weak spot if you ask me. It's the one that in my opinion fits in the most next to current Mark II vehicles, as most of the characteristic and quirky elements of the Mark I design are covered up by metal components. Yes, it's shorter, both in height and length. Its tracks do not wrap around the front, and it still uses the bent chimney-like exhausts, but the hull gap, the round doors, the sloped front plate or the split plates that were so characteristic of the profile of these vehicles are nowhere to be seen on this variant. Additionally, the tank crew at the top is not manning the main armament, unlike in the earlier Razorback and Whirlwind designs. The 3rd edition releases took a different approach to crew than the 2nd edition era kits. Notably, they forego the use of pauldrons, which significantly increases the feasibility of them being able to utilize the hatches they protruded from. The 2nd edition crew members in the Razorback and the Whirlwind both wear pauldrons, with the Razorback's hatch design obviously keeping this in mind, as already mentioned in its own section. The Mark II Rhino design would return to including pauldrons for the gunner, which in my opinion just further exacerbated, and still does, the question of the Rhino's scale and how Space Marines can actually fit in that thing. Not that the Mark I kit did not have this issue, mind you, it was considerably smaller than the Mark II, but the pauldronless gunners at least did not make this issue so glaring.
The traitor cousins of the Astartes would receive their own versions of the Rhino and the Predator in the April and May of the same year. These were also almost left out, as they were never featured in any of the Chaos Codices, being released at essentially the same time as the first 3rd edition Chaos Codex, and, as we've already learnt from the case of the Baal Predator and Codex Blood Angels, during this time, if the model didn't exist prior to the release of the Codex, it just didn't make it into the colour section. The vehicles in the first 3rd edition Codex were thus conversions, and the Mark II chassis was well into production by the time the Chaos 3.5 Codex was released, and it featured those instead. The Rhino received an extra sprue of spikes and Chaosy armor plates, making it technically the 3rd full plastic Mark I Rhino-based kit. These parts are still in production today on one of the sprues included with the current Mark II Chaos vehicle line. The Predator got demonic-faced resculpts of its Predator autocannon, and sponson heavy bolters and las cannons in white metal in addition to the plastic spike sprue, which was already included in the Rhino. The rest of its metal components were the same as those in the Loyalist Destructor kit. Now, in attempting to track down some official images of the metal Predator weapons that weren't just eBay listings, I happened across what seems like 4 further Mark I Chaos vehicles, which to my knowledge had never been advertised elsewhere, in issue number 17 of the UK edition of Troll, GW's mail-order magazine. Troll was essentially a way of making the mail-order section at the end of White Dwarf thinner by printing all the pages which showed individual parts of new releases separately. While I can certainly understand the rationale, sometimes I can't help but feel Games Workshop's marketing team in the 90s pulled shit like this deliberately just to screw with hyper-obsessive nerds like me 20 years down the line. The 4 vehicles featured in Troll UK number 17 were meant to represent some of the Chaos-specific vehicle upgrades featured in their new codex. The first 2 were labelled as Easy. All the parts needed to build these vehicles are supplied. Of these, the first, the Tzeentch Rhino with coruscating warp flame, was actually a conversion featured in the painting and modelling tips section. All the parts which were used for it were evidently just bundled into a mail-order exclusive kit upon the release of the codex. The Possessed Predator seems to draw inspiration from the one in the same codex, but that conversion was clearly more involved, requiring sculpting several details with green stuff. This kit seems to just include most of the tentacles and demonic faces used in the original. It's also glaringly obvious, despite the black and white photography, that this model was photographed unpainted. The second two bear the ominous warning that all these conversion will require a degree of modelling skill. The first is a Rhino with the Destroyer upgrade dedicated to the Bloodgod Khorne, which, despite feeling like I definitely have seen in colour somewhere before, I cannot find in any of my codices or any of the old issues of White Dwarf that I own. To be fair, my sense of deja vu might have just been triggered by having seen something similar many times, or even one of these very kits on a Warhammer blog when blogging was still a thing 7 years ago. Who knows? The thing is, the model here seems painted, so GW likely did feature it in colour at least once somewhere. The Destroyer Rhino in the Codex used a lot of non-GW parts, such as brass rods and plastic tubing, which they couldn't sell, so this Rhino conversion, relying more heavily on metal Citadel bits from probably the Fantasy range, was released. While the image is not too clear, unfortunately, the reason I've not zoomed in further is because that would look like this. It seems to me that the reason this is listed as requiring a degree of modelling skill is that the supports for the spiky roller at the front seem to be fashioned from plastic sprues cut and bent into shape. The final and very intimidating kit, both in complexity and price, representing the Nurgle Infestation upgrade on a Predator again rings a bell, but I think that's because I've seen similar whirly spinny blades elsewhere. Either way, this is clearly a lot more involved than all the others. In this grainy scan, I can make out what looks like Annihilator turret las cannons, somehow made to fit inside a Destructor turret, a process which would have involved serious drilling, sawing, and pinning of white metal, as the base of the Destructor and Annihilator turrets use completely different and very incompatible mounting points. This is topped off with Rhino side doors as stop hatches, some tentacles of unclear origin, a spinny flesh mower attached in a similarly fragile way to the above example in the Khorne Rhino, and a lot of metal Nurglings all over the hull. The way the name is written below as Nurgle Predator Infestation made me wonder for a second if this implied that Infestation was meant to be the vehicle's class designation, such as Annihilator or Destructor on the Loyalist side. This is because Predator Infestation sounds in line with Chaos naming schemes of the time. Looking at you, Battlefleet Gothic Chaos spaceships. But seeing as it's just a vehicle upgrade in the Codex and not a separate stat line, this was likely not the intention. So that's a Tzeentch, a Nurgle, and a Khorne dedicated vehicle, as well as a generic possessed one. What about Slaanesh? Troll includes a Slaaneshi dreadnought instead of a tracked vehicle. This makes sense. Recreating the Slaaneshi warp amp from the Chaos Codex would have either meant designing a kit with enough white metal components to constitute a war crime, or branching out into the industry of manufacturing aluminium tubes to cut to length and sell as bits. So yeah, that's yet another research rabbit hole I descended into, hundreds of hours into editing this monstrosity. Hopefully, there won't be too many more of these. The script was written in April, and the audio was all already recorded in August of 1999 saw the release of an updated metal Razorback kit with a new turret shield and weapon options today's players would be more familiar with, twin heavy bolters or twin las cannons. People had, however, been making do without this upgrade in the meantime, for example by using las cannon sponsons from the Predator kit like in the case of this White Scars Razorback, featured in Chapter Approved 2003. All the other components of the kit remain the same as before, including the 2nd edition Space Marine gunner in the turret and the triple hatched doors. There's not much more to say about it other than the fact that this was possibly the last mixed component Space Marine tank released by Games Workshop.
Possibly because an honourable mention must go to the Salamander-specific Predator Destructor variant, which came into being upon the release of the Armageddon Campaign Codex in 2000. In keeping with the Salamander's characteristic partiality towards flame and heat-based firearms, the Salamanders could upgrade their Destructors with heavy flamer sponsons. While this Predator was never released on its own as a kit to my knowledge, nor did it receive a unique variant name, it was included in the Salamander's army box sold at the same time as the Armageddon Codex. Thus, the kit was produced by Games Workshop, just never released on its own. This is likely because this variant did not include any unique parts. If a player wanted just one of these tanks without the rest of the army bundle, they could just buy a Predator Destructor and mail order some heavy flamers and Prometheum fuel tanks. So that's that. the story of the Mark I Rhino Chassis. The release of the Mark II in 2002 would begin this whole process anew, with all the other tanks using it as a basis, needing to be reworked as well, this time as plastic kits, much like the original Predator in 1989.
With that, I shall have to bid you all sweet adieu for now. Thank you for watching this video. As already mentioned, I had originally intended to include the restoration of the Predators in this as well, but let's be honest, no one would actually click on that thumbnail if they saw the timestamp. It'll be uploaded separately at some point, hopefully soon, but I've got to re-edit some parts as I am no longer satisfied with how they turned out, and other parts of it haven't even been edited yet. As I was working on a small-scale stop-motion animation to use in the showcase at the end, the zero-tolerance policy announcement in the summer basically killed all the passion I had for this project. Part 1 was essentially finished at that point, but the project remained untouched until December. Part 2 will happen at some point, as I have put way too many hours into it to scrap, but it might not be as soon as I had just optimistically implied. We'll have to see. Many thanks to those of you who have remained subscribed despite the channel showing no signs of life since last April. I will not make any empty promises of more frequent uploads, but things like this will eventually make it to the channel. I hope you can appreciate that they take quite a long time to research and edit, so I have no illusions nor aspirations about becoming famous on the internet or anything. These topics simply interest me and I like to look into and talk about them. If nothing more, they're good as practice in presenting my findings as an aspiring historian. So, part 2 coming at some point in the future, and I know what episode 3 will be about already. I have all the components, bits, and, everything. It's just now a question of finding the time. Episode 3 may yet be released this year. What the future holds is, however, uncertain. Good luck out there, folks. Ghostly Frog, out.